Can you use "we see" in your screenplay? I mean, you've probably heard something like, it's a rule, you can't do that. But then you go and read some scripts and there it is, right on the page, "we see," and it's from a pro. So what are you supposed to do? You hear a rule that says you can't use it, and yet you're seeing other people use it. So can you use "we see"? Can you not use "we see"? And today we're gonna rip this band-aid off. And if you're not sure what all the ruckus is about, we're going to get into that too, because there are a couple of good reasons that people don't like it. Thank you so much for watching. We just passed 200 subscribers as I'm recording this, so thank you for doing that. I'm so thankful. If I can help, if there's a question you have, drop it in the comments below. There's some other things in the links below. Be sure to check those out. They might be helpful. Okay, can you use "we see"? Let's jump in. I'm sure you've probably heard the mantra of don't direct the camera in your screenplay. Don't use things like cut to, smash to, pan across, etc. The way around this for a lot of writers is to just use "we see." I mean, that's actually where it comes from, is just replacing a camera shot and saying "we see a close-up of this," but not using the word close-up. I mean, it's exactly the same thing, and that's really where it comes from. And in this context, you can probably quickly imagine why people don't like seeing "we see" on the page, because essentially you are trying to direct the camera. That's really where it comes from, and that's their history with it. The other issue is a lot of newer writers tend to overuse it. So they think, oh, I can use it, and then it's just a script littered with "we see, we see, we see, we see," and it's really distracting, and that's problematic. And if it were just that, it would be simple to fix. It's easy to work around taking camera directions out of a script, removing the angle on and close on and push in and things like that, just by how you describe things in the script kind of helps you get rid of those. So if it was just that, we could get rid of all the "we sees, but there's more to it than that. And there's a lot of heated opinions about whether you should or whether you shouldn't use it. So what is all this ruckus about? I mean, where is it coming from? So let's get into that, and then we're going to chat about whether or not you should use it. One of the reasons that using "we see" causes a lot of heated opinions is because in using it, it breaks the fourth wall. That's talking to the audience. So this concept of the fourth wall, if you're not familiar with it, is a theater term. And if you're looking at a stage, right, you have a side wall, a back wall, and a third side wall. So that's 3 walls, and the audience is just kind of looking in. But when the actors on stage talk to the audience, they are breaking the fourth wall. So that's where that term comes from. And if you use "we see" in a script, well, what you're doing is you are essentially standing on the stage talking to the audience saying, hey, this is what you see. And that kind of takes us out of the story. Essentially what it does is it makes us and reminds us that we are watching a movie instead of experiencing one. And you want someone, when they're reading your script, to experience the story, to live the story, to see the story. And spec scripts, which is what most of you are writing, should be read and experienced. Shooting scripts are completely different animals. Okay, so if it's a shooting script and you start talking about, well, we're going to do this and this and this, okay, that's totally different. If you find scripts that are written by someone who's also directing the film, you're going to see a lot of the "we sees" in it, because they're thinking about their shooting script and they're thinking about, how am I actually going to pull this off? And so this is a way they use to communicate to other people on the production. But when you're writing a spec script, you don't want to use it. And as a result, it starts to come off as amateurish at best and sloppy at worst if you start using "we see" in the script. And a lot of people start getting really heated about this, because when you read a script, you should be experiencing the story. And that's your goal as a storyteller. You want people to kind of get lost in the story. You don't want to remind them that you're reading a story. And this is why things like directing the camera is usually not good in a spec script. This is why you don't really capitalize a whole lot of things. Yes, you capitalize characters. There's a few other things you capitalize, but you generally don't do it. You don't want to draw attention to things and pull people out of the story. Just let them experience it. There is another big negative of why people get upset about seeing "we see" in the script, but I'm going to get to that in 1 second. I think it's going to be helpful to talk about some of the exceptions. There's always exceptions, right? There's never a hard and fast rule, okay? There's always exceptions. So let's talk about a couple of the exceptions. The first exception of when "we see" might be okay is when the audience sees something that a character just doesn't see. Okay, the character's doing their own thing, but the audience is going to see something else. So the character's doing their thing, and we see a killer sneak inside, right? But you could also write, John's watching the TV, doesn't see the killer sneak inside. Okay, well, that implies that we are seeing the killer sneak inside because he doesn't see it, but we're aware of it, so we must obviously be seeing it, right? So do you really need to use the we see in that moment? Well, probably not. There's other ways around it, but this can be an exception if you're going to be using it in a very specific way, and I'll talk about that in a second. Another exception is if there is a distinctive point of view for the movie that you want the audience to have. So you want the audience to have a very specific point of view. So they're going to see things that characters don't. Typically in a movie, we follow the main character and then we kind of get little tidbits of other people. So it's kind of like an omniscient narrator in a sense. So we get all these. Every once in a while, you have a limited narrator, right? They're just kind of focusing on one character. So that one character is pretty much in all of the scenes, and you only see scenes that that character is in. So that's another way. But sometimes you have a story where you just kind of, it's like there's another character in the story, and it's the audience, right? It's like the audience is moving through the story, and they're moving here and moving here. And so in that sense, we have a unique perspective that stays throughout the story. So if you're wanting to do that, like you're trying to communicate, hey, I want the audience to be experience this very specific point of view, well, maybe you might need to be using we see to differentiate it from what's going on in the story. That way, people can kind of a little better track with the type of point of view that they're supposed to have. Those two exceptions get at the other big negative for using we see in your story. I mean, if you use we see just randomly or inconsistently or without any seeming reason to use it, okay, that's a problem. And a lot of writers and people that are really into the craft get upset. And I honestly, full disclosure, I kind of have to put myself in this camp a little bit. If you are just randomly putting things in, language is a storytelling tool, and the words you use are helping you tell the story. So if you use we see, it should be specific and intentional. So when you write, you want to use specific words. You want to use intentional words. And if you're using anything inconsistently or without intention, including we see, it just comes off as bad writing. Now, if you use it consistently or with intention, can you use it? Well, that gets into the next big question, which is, should you use it? I mean, if you're using it consistently or you're using it intentionally, okay, it's kind of like, well, now you kind of have the option to use it. If you're using it for one of the exceptions we noted, where maybe you're wanting to really specify that the audience sees something that the characters don't, and you can't find a better way to say it, or you're trying to create a very specific point of view. So if it's kind of meeting those criteria, it's like, well, maybe you can use it, but then you got to ask, should you use it? And before I get into that, let me just ask you, please subscribe if you haven't. If you're finding value, hit the like button, drop a comment below. If you got a question specifically about we see or something that you just want me to cover in a future video, I really appreciate that. YouTube really loves it when people interact in some way. So if you can just do one of those, that would be great. Okay, should you use we see? Well, the beautiful thing about language is there is always another way to say something. Like, for me, the we see argument really just boils down to two sides. Okay, so you have, on one side, you have people that would argue it's either distracting or it's not distracting to the read, that it depends on the pacing of the story and the audience, and so they may say you shouldn't use it because it's distracting, or somebody might say you should use it because it's distracting, but it's all still in this kind of realm of distracting, not distracting. The other side is using we see tends to reflect on the writer's abilities and the writer's voice. Some voices, some people, when they write, they can just get away with it easier because their voice, their writing voice, is a little more conversational. But for other writers who are a little more specific or terse or just kind of just jamming through, like, it doesn't play right. Like, it just doesn't fit. So you can kind of have, if you think about it in these kind of two groups, is it distracting or not distracting? Is it a reflection of the writer's abilities and the writer's voice? Now, again, let me say, if you haven't heard me say this clearly, so I want to say it very specifically, there really is no hard and fast rule about whether or not you should use we see in your script. You know, some writers are adamant you use it, while others are adamant that you don't. And, you know, if you use it for this exception or this other exception, it's fine. If you don't want to do it, don't do it. And others are like, don't use it ever. Others say, you know, use it if it helps. You know, personally for me, I default to just trying to not use it. But my writing voice doesn't lend itself to use it. So when I include it, if I've ever included it, it just comes across as bad. It's distracting. It stands out on the page. For you, it may not be that bad. But I'd recommend you consider the following questions before you choose to use we see in your script. Is the use of we see distracting? I mean, does it get in the way of the read? Does it pull the reader out? So if it does that, you don't want to use it. Second question. Is there another way? Can you find another way to say what you're trying to say without using we see? Third, what's the script for? I mean, what are you submitting it for? Is it for a contest or a fellowship? And if it's for a contest or a fellowship, you probably don't want to use it because you're going to get readers that are a little more picky, and they might have even been directed. If you see a script that says we see, just kick it right off the bat because it's automatically amateurish. Okay, so you probably want to be avoiding it for that. If you're submitting it to a studio or a production house, a pod, well, maybe use it depending on the story, depending on your voice, all those kinds of things. And that's the next question. Does it match my writing voice? And if you really can't describe your own writing voice, you may not know if it fits or not. So if you can't really do that, if you can't articulate, oh, my writing voice is kind of like blank, I would advise caution in using we see. Doesn't mean you can't, I just say caution. And the last question you should consider whether or not to use we see is if you are using it more than once, is the use consistent? For example, the audience sees something but the character doesn't. It's just like any tool. Using we see, if you use it, be consistent with its use and have a reason for using it. Now, here's the thing. No one is going to chastise you or kick your script or punt you or throw you in screenwriter jail if you don't use we see. It's not in the script. They're not going to be upset at you. But they might be upset or a little persnickety if you do use it. So can you rebel and use it? Well, sure you can, but just make sure you're using it for the right reason. Make sure you know why you're using it, be consistent with its use, all those kind of things I've already talked about. And when you're starting out, here's the other thing to think about is if you're submitting it to people and they're not going to be mad if it's not there, but they might get a little frustrated if it is there, then why are you giving yourself an extra hurdle in front of you when you could just avoid it? Like you're making it more difficult for you. So just avoid it, especially starting out. Now, if you've sold a couple of scripts and you've figured out your voice and you know you can do it and get away with it, okay, that's different. If you know what you're using it for, that's different. But if you're starting out, don't give yourself an extra hurdle. So I tend to recommend to new writers, you probably want to avoid using we see. Can you? Yes, you can. Should you? Well, it depends. Again, I'm going to recommend toward the no end of the spectrum, especially early on. So find a better way to say what you're trying to say. One other little caveat is if you're writing your first draft or second draft, right? It's an early draft and it slips in. Don't chastise yourself. Don't get upset at yourself. Don't beat yourself up. Just, you're trying to get to the end. So just write it to the end. Don't worry about that little stuff. You can filter that out in subsequent drafts. So don't worry about if you find it in like a first draft, like, oh no, I'm a horrible writer. No, you're not. We all do that. Like I'll put it in there, but I tend to pull all of mine out. So just try to find a better way to use it. And if you see it in your stuff, don't worry about it. Revise, rework. It's going to be fine. Hopefully this has been helpful to you. If it has, please be sure to like, subscribe, bell, all that stuff, especially if you found value. I really appreciate it. Be sure to check out links below. Those might be helpful to you. And when you go to tell a story, whether you include we see or not, tell a story that matters. See you later.